Welcome to the Gamification Report, episode 15. Today we're going to be looking at the gamification of academic research, the gamification of research and development, and long-term studies on game-based learning. Some fascinating work by Barada. You've got to know this literature. So let's get started today. I think we're going to have a lot of fun with this. We're going to start with Bjorn Hammerfeldt and his team in 2017. And what they did is they quantified self and gamification academic research through social networks. So it's this whole idea called the quantified self that's emerging. You can see it in Facebook. The number of likes you get, the number of people that might share a post that you put on LinkedIn. All of these little things we do is what's called the quantified self. So what they did is they began to look at ResearchGate, which has about 12 million users. And what you get in ResearchGate is whatever papers you publish are assigned a ResearchGate score. And of course, that score has to do with the number of publications, your impact factor, that's how much people depend on it, and user activity. So then it does ranks users. So it looks at whether you're better than or less than the percentage of users that are out using it. And you get reminders, for example. So it might say, hey, this week your paper got 20 new readers and it's been cited 100 times. And what this is a form of gamification. It's essentially using social networks to gamify through self-measurement to see how you're doing with your Facebook likes or in this case, publication rights. And so what you can do is you can update your profile, you can harvest likes and upload contacts. And so this has to do with this idea of what they call maps, for example, care maps that are used in the Netherlands, where patients can rate healthcare. They can say this doctor was terrible, this doctor was excellent, this dentist was good, etc. These kind of rate my prof abilities. These use the same kind of gamification principles as we see in places like ResearchGate. And so this means that scientists that function these days and publish and scholars are functioning as entrepreneurs, and they're not used to doing that. They sit in their lab and they publish, and you try to use these things. You always did gamify to some degree, because when it came time for grant time, you had to say, well, I've had this many papers that I produced. But now scientists are functioning like an entrepreneur, and this is called a form of everyday liberalism, according to the authors of this paper, which is based on the doctrine of aspiring by Peter Slojerde. And Slojerde talked about this fact that we want to become better, and we feel better when we go to Facebook and there's lots of likes and people are looking at our pictures and they're sharing our content. We are actually gamifying our process of being approved of in a larger social context. So this leads to what's called self-tracking and representative images in scholarly work. You can actually talk about the number of people reading your papers and the impact that it's having. Now, the dangers of this, of course, and we're starting to see it in social network theory, in social network analysis, is that we have the reduction of rich data into a few indicators. So this is what's called Facebookization, and the idea that becomes a focus. So if everyone's reading your paper, then you seem to be a scholar in the field. And we're seeing this in what's called the Gamification Guru Top 100. Now, around the world, there are what are called gamification gurus, and these are people like Gabe Zickerman or Andrzej Marczowski or Monica Cornetti. There's all kinds of people I could cite, and please forgive me if I don't mention other people like UK Chow, etc., that are big gamification experts. Now, these are top 100 in the world, and they have to do with their impact and their publications, etc. But the problem is this kind of Facebook approach, and it's being criticized by people that are even in the top 5, is that it's based, for example, on how often your work is retweeted. But I know people that aren't in the top 100, like David Kaufman at Simon Fraser University, who has at times held up close to $1 million of research funding on gamification, and Louise Sauvé from Quebec. There's people like Leonard Naki at the University of Waterloo. I could talk about Bill Karpalis at UIOT. Just in Canada alone, we've got tons of scholars that aren't in the top 100, and yet they're doing fundamental work in the field and changing the field as we speak with publications and research. But no one would know they exist because this Facebookization of the top 100 of game gurus takes over, and it's giving you this kind of narrow, this is how many times they retweet what you say. They're not looking at the impact you're actually making, which is doing fundamental research in the field. So you see this kind of problem we run into in this doctrine of aspiring. Now, this kind of spills over into gamification and research, but there's some incredible positives that we don't want to neglect that come out of this. Andrea Cristina Ionica and Monica Leba in 2015 looked at a paper exploring gamification and research. And this was the idea that master students could receive points, badges, and leaderboards related to how they'd solve problems. And they would also have structured brainstorming to try to do rewards and attach those. There was a great thing which kind of public called Folded, which was based at the University of Washington, and it looked at protein folding, and they were trying to look at when a protein forms, how it would fold, because there's millions of ways it can fold, and that changes its functional activities. And so they had about 57,000 people that were all players in the game, and they were looking at how you could fold a protein. So it was a game in which the entire community, and in 2010 they published their work, and they showed that this game actually outperformed algorithmically computed solutions. So when you engage many people in the research community with solutions, this can outperform conventional techniques. Now, there's some other kinds of ways that we can gamify research, and this is what they did in the study, in Leba and Ionica's work. They used what was called quest-based design of research. So what you did is your quest one might be assigning a team-based role, and that is that you would have to accomplish something in your research first. It might be to identify a protein or identify a social problem, or let's say a difference between two different sets of data. So then you would receive a power-up in the game, that is something to give you some strength in the game, maybe identifying a statistical tool. And when you did, then you would move to the second quest, which in this case was software design. Would you build software then that would help you solve that research problem? Then you might receive a power-up in the form of other resources or abilities that were provided in the game, such as key publications or key members joining your research staff. And then you would have a badge, what was called an epic win, then a power-up, then more obstacles, and then events and quests. So you could design an entire program of research, let's try to find a vaccine for HIV, around a gamified structure. You would have these different steps that you would have to take in order to eventually get to the end goal of developing a good vaccine. And we kind of do this in research, but by making it explicit in the game, it allowed people to enter different stages of the quest, maybe as a team, to search for solutions together. And this comes down to some interesting work that came out in 2017, a paper by Leonard Naki on the maturing of gamification research. Now, Leonard Naki is located at the University of Waterloo, and he's one of the top gamification researchers in Canada and maybe in the world. He does absolutely great work connecting on games and learning and other aspects. So he writes in this paper, which is an introduction to a conference, the idea of self-determination theory is being very strong. And what he's trying to argue is that game elements increase performance, but not through increasing intrinsic motivation. We hear this a lot in learning games, that they increase your intrinsic motivation, your desire to learn, not because you're getting a grade, but because you want to learn. But using self-determination theory, we're not really having intrinsic motivation that's making us learn. We're increasing our performance because we have more ability to do so, because the game is enabling us. It's not like we have higher intrinsic motivation to learn, it's that we have higher resources through the game to give us a higher level of performance. And he talks about in his paper, and interesting that a lot of us have noted, of leaderboard negatives. Because if you're in a leaderboard competing against other people in a game, and you're not doing well, then you can't win, then you're going to feel lousy about the game, because no matter what you do, you can't get ahead. So there's long-term studies that are incoming that we want to begin to look at in terms of some of these basics of game-based learning. So in this interest, he points us to the work of Gabriel Barata again, this is a typo, it was 2017, studying student differentiation in gamified education, a long-term study. Now, this is the first study that looked at game-based learning over 3 years with different varieties of students to try to understand what happens in gamified learning in the long term. And it's a great study, so given that Naki has asked us to look at this, let's do so, and let's dig a little deep in this study. Grades became XP in this game, and this is a Lee Sheldon's model. So you don't give people grades, you give them experience points. It's a very compelling points badge leaderboard model. So essentially, you get points for doing things in the game, you get badges in the game, and you get on leaderboard. And they had different groups which showed different types of game-like experience. So initially, they identified 3 different types of learners: the achievers, the underachievers, and the disheartened. And then they added other observed groups as they looked at their data, which was called the late awakeners, half-hearteds, and the regular students. So what it meant is that people, as they engaged with the game, weren't homogenous. They broke into groups. So over a 3-year study, they know that the first group were the achievers, and these had the largest and steepest experience point curves. They collected all the badges you could get in the game, and they consistently over the years really engaged the game and really played it and did everything you could do in the game. These are your ideal game-based learning students, the people you want, and they make your research look really good. But another group emerged almost as strong called the underachievers. They had the lowest experience points, they had the lowest rank on leaderboards, they had the lowest number of badges, least proactive and participative. And what's interesting is over the 3 years of the study, that remained constant. It was almost like a fixed trait. If you were an underachiever, you stayed underachiever. And that was their initial findings. However, they found that there were other subgroups. There were what they called disheartened groups. Now, these were people that initially got a lot of XP, did a lot of badges, but then they had a performance drop. So they had just as high as achievers with XP gain, but their participation and attendance dropped over time. They liked the game when you asked them about it, but they didn't really work at it as much. So they called those the third group. As they looked at their data over time, there was a group that emerged in the second year, which they called the late awakeners. And these were people that had slightly above average experience point gains, and they were probably disheartened students who started to like the game because they stayed with it. So this is really interesting. You remember, these aren't people just taking a simple course where you get a grade and you're in and you're out. They used a similar game over 3 years that developed more and more skill, and when they did, they saw these different patterns emerge. Then they had another group they called the regular students. Now, the regular students had high engagement in the game. Their experience points, that is their grades, would be just under that of achievers. They were only observed in the third year, and that the game seemed to be evolving. Because as they played the game, as most of us discover, you don't just give a game to learners. You give the game, but then you add new experiences as you go. You add new challenges. You may change the rules because you're talking to your students as you're learning, and these continues. So the game was evolving. More experiences were possible, and this probably reached out. So if you make a game in which you listen to students and give them more activities they like, you get these regular students that emerge that don't do as well as achievers, but they have a high level of engagement. Fascinating stuff. They had another group they identified looking at cluster analysis of their data, and they emerged only in the third year of the game, and this represented almost 25% of players. And these were the half-hearteds. They had lower experience points, i.e. grades and achievement, than the achievers, but they had higher grades than the underachievers. They were not highly engaged in the game, so they were kind of playing the game, but they weren't too excited about it, but they were able to get good XP. So when they overall looked at the performance, looking back over 3 years of play, the achievers and the regular gave the highest scores. The regulars focused on the final outputs of the game. That is, they were playing the game to get the job done, to learn what they wanted to learn. They said, I got to learn it through a game, so I might as well do it, and I'll get to do what I want. Whereas the achievers were students that focused on the game itself. They got involved in the game, and they wanted to do as many things as they could to complete it. The half-hearted and disheartened players were lower in both XP and outcomes. And the participation rates in terms of the game, the achievers were the highest. And higher participation was correlated in all cases with performance. People that did well in the game, did well in course performance, could do the job in the real world. This parallels findings and achievements in higher education, where we show that people that attend lectures more and do other measures show higher outcomes. People that really take a course seriously and do all the work that you ask them will obviously do better than don't. So what can we take away from this message? It shows us that heterogeneity exists across players, and the studies suffer from things we know we can improve. One of them is that we know what we want: consistent narrative and evolving narrative structure. You don't want a game that's very boring over many years over time. And we're using that now. We have a game that, again, we've developed in our Baycrest, a virtual hospital development study in terms of producing a long-term care virtualized internship. And we have two different courses. But the courses have got 15 weeks in length, but they're built on one game. So in the first course, you go into the game world and you have to explore this ward, and you have to solve different cases, and you acquire these different skills and consult skills. But in the second game, the narrative is continued, but all the things you've accomplished in the first course carry into the second. It's the idea of consistent narrative that allows the person to explore, and the idea of evolving narrative structure, that it's not a simple little story of there's a fire and you've got to put it out. It's the idea that you're in a world with a narrative structure, and the narrative changes all the time to keep you engaged. What was very powerful in the study was the idea of detailed avatar progression, that you were a character in the game and you improved. That you had player versus player engagement. You were able to compete with other players, and that was very important in these games. There was an opportunity to complete. That there was an open game world design with what we call a conglomeration of player tasks, many things to do in the game. And that what they saw in the games and where they suffered was the lack of a compelling graphics interface and the lack of rewards you can use in the game. So these are things that we have to watch out for. We don't want the game interface, the way you play the game, to be too simplistic, because video gamers now expect a lot more. And also the lack of rewards that you can use in the game. This is so important. When you get a badge, you can't use the badge in the game. But if the badge allows opening to new content, or you can take the badge and it gives you new weapons or abilities, then you're getting rewards you can use to make the game more interesting, rather than just getting a reward, which is a symbolic value. These are in-game rewards, so you must be able to earn a reward in the game, use it to advance gameplay, appealing to many core needs. So therefore, badges are relatively weak benchmarks compared to usable rewards. This is David Chandross at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Humber College. I hope we've had a great exploration today about how to produce good, compelling learning games based on good long-term studies that are starting to accumulate. Have a great week.